Hey everyone, how's it going? Forrest here, again with another installment of my complete analysis of all of J.S. Bach's chorale harmonizations. Today we're looking at Lass, O Herr, dein, sich, neigen, which translates to, and this is a rough translation, O Lord, let thy ear incline. Very straightforward chorale today, really not too much to write home about. There's one little quirky chord progression later into the chorale, but we're just going to hop right into the analysis. Make sure I have my notes for this one. One flat in the key signature. We start on G minor and we end on G major. So I reckon the overall tonality of this chorale is G minor. It's somewhat common for Bach to use variable key signatures when in minor keys like G minor or C minor, or even further along the circle of fifths to the flat side of the circle of fifths. It's really a toss-up whether or not the key will have one flat or two flats. In this case, we're in G minor and there's one flat. There's also equally as many chorales that are signatured with a two flat key signature. But we start off with our tonic triad, passing tone in the bass, and then we get G minor over B flat, B flat, B flat, D, and G. Another passing tone in the bass here before we get D major, D, A, D, and F sharp, which is our 5 chord, passing 7th in the bass, and then we get B flat, D, and G again, which is 1-6. That briefly gets turned into root position with this G right here. And as we're getting ready for our first cadence, which is a perfect authentic cadence in the key of G minor, we have F sharp, C, E flat, and A, and we get this figure which is somewhat common in Bach, where we have something that can be interpreted as one of two chords. In my opinion, it's a 7-7 chord, F sharp fully diminished, but if you look at this E flat as an accented non-chord tone and this D as the root of the chord, you could analyze it as 5-6-5 as well. They're basically the same chord, the only difference is the 7 of the F sharp diminished and the root of the D 7 chord. Either way, it resolves to the same chord, G minor, G, B flat, D, and B flat, tonic triad, root position. D is a chord tone, and G is a chord tone, so we don't need to mark them. Then we have C, E flat, G, and A. We know that Bach loves 2-6-5 chords, especially in cadential context. Sorry, my writing's like askew today. I'll try and fix that. We then have D major, D, D, F sharp, and that same A, which is our 5 chord, typically what we expect after a 2-6-5 chord anyways, passing 7th in the tenor, and then we cadence on G minor, G, B flat, D, and G. Next phrase stays in the key of G minor, ends with a half cadence. We start off with the G minor chord, G, D, G, and B flat, so we don't need to reanalyze. We then get D major, D, D, G, and A, this G being a 4-3 suspension over the bass, relatively common in the middle of phrases for 4-3 suspensions to happen over dominant triads. And we get a little passing 7th here as well in the tenor before we get E flat, B flat, G, and G. It's a 6 chord, E flat major, could be a 4-6 chord as well, depending on whether this C is the root of the chord. I don't really think it makes too much of a difference though in the grand scheme of things. They're basically the same chord, both in terms of pitch content and in terms of function. That takes us to B flat, D, G, and B flat, which is 1-6, passing 7th in the this could be a 3 chord as well. If this G was a 6-5 suspension over the bass, I don't really think it makes too much of a difference though, but I'm just going to call it a 1-6 chord with the passing 7th in the alto. We then have C, C, E flat, and A, which is A diminished in first inversion. That's a 2-6 chord. And then we get a bit of a passing chord before we end on our 5 chord. I'll just write that there, D, A, D, and F sharp. We get another chord progression similar to what we had here, where we have an interpretable chord, or a chord that has multiple interpretations. Here it looks like C sharp fully diminished 7th with C sharp, B flat, E, and G. That's 7-7 of 5, because it's C sharp's the leading tone to 5. but this could also be analyzed as 5, 6, 5 of 5. This has to do with whether or not this A is a chord tone or not. Moving on to the next phrase, we have a perfect authentic cadence in the key of G minor again, but we do start the phrase off in the key of B flat, and I feel like that's significant because we start off with a D minor chord, which is in direct contrast to the D major chord we have on the beat before. D minor is our 3 chord, D, F, A, and F. Passing tones in the alto and in the bass before we get B flat, F, C, and E flat. This B flat's probably an accented non-chord tone, and this A is probably a chord tone here, making this F7 over A, which is 5, 6, 5, and that takes us to our tonic B flat major, B flat, F, B flat, and D. Passing 7th in the bass, passing tone in the alto as well, before we get G minor, G, B flat, D, and G. That's our 6th chord, and I reckon this is where we go back to the key of G minor as well. It is now our tonic, and this B flat's a chord tone, but it briefly takes the chord and puts it in first inversion. We then have C, A, E flat, and G, which is 2, 6, 5. We know that Bach loves 2, 6, 5 chords, especially in cadential contexts. This A is a chord tone, so we don't need to mark it. We then have D, A, D, and F sharp, which is our 5 chord, D major. Passing tones, part of this like little ornamental figure here. B flat's a non-chord tone. C is the chordal 7th, but it's not part of the initial sort of established chord, so I'm going to mark it as a non-chord tone. And then we cadence on G minor, which is our tonic, G, B flat, D, and G. Next phrase ends in a perfect authentic cadence in the key of B flat major. Oh, I just wrote B flat there. Sorry, that's a perfect authentic cadence. We start off with a G minor chord, G, D, G, and B flat, which is also our tonic triad in the key of G minor, so we don't need to reanalyze there. But I think it's also our pivot to the key of B minor. It's our 6th chord. That takes us to 5, F, F, A, and C. It's F major in root position with a passing 7th in the bass. And then we get D, F, B flat, and D, which is our tonic triad in first inversion. We get a passing tone here in the bass as well before we get B flat, F, B flat, and D. Sorry, I'm just going to move my microphone a bit. It's blocking my vantage point. And with this passing A flat here, I think this is our tonic not functioning as a tonic purely, but rather having a higher function of 5 of 4. Because this A flat has a tendency to imply that we're going to get a 4 chord on the next beat. But here's the interesting progression. Instead of going directly to 4, we get a secondary deceptive progression. We get B flat, E flat, G, and C, which in the key of G minor is 4, 4, 2, but in the key of B flat major, it is 2, 4, 2. And we would expect this to resolve to a 5, 6 chord, which it does. If we take all of these non-chord tones on the end of the beat, it turns into a 5, 6 chord with A, C, F, and C. So 5, 6 happening on the end of the beat. So a secondary deceptive progression that resolves normally, or it resolves, actually doesn't really, well, the 2, 4, 2 chord resolves the way it does, but the secondary dominant resolves to the 6, the secondary submediant, which is a relatively common place for the chord to resolve. We actually saw some more interesting secondary deceptive progressions in yesterday's chorale. It's quite a long video, but you can check it out if you want to fast forward to that particular part. It's somewhere around the 2nd page of the chorale. Sorry, I can't give you a timestamp. But 5, 6 will typically resolve to 1, B flat, D, F, and B flat, which is our tonic. D and B flat swapping here in the lower voices does take the chord and put it in first inversion very briefly, and that takes us to C minor, 7 over E flat, B flat, G, and C. It's 2, 6, 5. We know that Bach loves 2, 6, 5 chords, especially in cadential contexts. C is a chord tone, A is a non-chord tone, G is a chord tone, so we don't need to mark these two. We then get F, A, F, and C, which is our 5 chord, F major, passing 7th in the alto, and then we cadence on B flat major, B flat, D, and B flat. Tonic triad, root position, 3 roots and 1/3, spelling. Moving on to the next phrase, we get another perfect authentic cadence, which is very similar to the previous phrase in terms of its profile and its harmonic content, but different enough to not warrant a repeat. So starting off the phrase, we have another tonic triad that is B flat major in root position, B flat, B flat, D, F, and B flat. That takes us to F in first inversion, this B being a lower suspension, A, C, F, A, C, F, and C. It's 5, 6, and that takes us to B flat major, B flat, C, D, F, and D. 9/8 suspensions are very common over tonic triads. And then here's a little interesting thing here. Bach scaffolds this octave by leaping up a 5th in the bass. So the chord very briefly turns into like a 6/4 chord by interrupting the resolution. So I really feel like the big resolution is on beat 4, but the immediate resolution to the B flat is here over this F. So the chord very briefly turns into second inversion and then right back to root position. So it's not really a huge deal, but this is a pattern that I'm not super familiar with, and typically much more common to skip up a 3rd in the bass or step up a 3rd in the bass over a beat and or 2 beats. But yeah, it's kind of interesting to see the 6/4 chord added in here as a little contrapuntal gesture. That takes us to F major, F, A, F, and C. It's our 5 chord, passing 7th in the alto, and then we get G, B flat, D, and B flat. So a bit of a deceptive progression here to 6, but Bach is going to turn that back around into a cycle of falling fifths progression that will lead us to our cadence. Passing 7th in the bass, E flat, B flat, G, and C. It's 2, 6, 5, C minor, 7 over E flat. We know that Bach loves 2, 6, 5 chords, especially in cadential contexts. Then we get F major, F, A, F, and that same C, which is our 5 chord. That's the cycle. Passing 7th in the alto again. And then we cadence on B flat major, B flat, F, D, and B flat, leading us to the next phrase, which keeps us in the key of G minor, or transports us to the key of G minor, which is what we will stay in for the rest of our analysis. So we start off with a G minor chord, G, G, D, and B flat. It's our 6 chord, and in the key of G minor it's also our tonic. We've seen 6 turn into 1 in other parts of the chorale, but you can call this a direct modulation too if you feel like that's more in line with your style and relationship with the harmony. It's always a toss-up with whether or not it's a common chord or a direct modulation at the beginnings of phrases, so don't completely just subscribe to this or look at it as black and white. It's definitely there's some variability here in terms of how you could approach it analytically speaking. 1 takes us to 5, D, F sharp, D, and A, D major, root position, that's our 5 chord, passing 7th in the alto. That takes us to 6, E flat, G, B flat, and G. It's E flat major in root position. And then we get some pretty heavy chromaticism here. Ascending chromaticism is fairly straightforward, but here's a little bit of a quirky progression, even quirkier than this progression. I didn't realize how quirky this progression was until I just reanalyzed it, but here is the quirky progression that I was referring to at the beginning of the video. We have E natural, so on the beat we have the same chord as before, except for the B flat turns into E flat. Into E flat, and G turns into B flat. I used my intuition to call that an E flat there. Usually I have to count, but because there's no flat in the key signature, I just assumed that was an E flat. I wanted to double check though. So the same chord is happening on beat 2, but on beat 3 with the E natural and the D, we have E, G, B flat, and D, which is 7, 7, half diminished of 7, and we saw tonicization of 7, or a potential tonicization of 7 yesterday, and it's not traditionally functional, but when we have chromatic bass lines, Bach has been known to expand the functionality of the harmony. So we're just basically ascending the scale from 6 to 1. We start with 6, we tonicize 7 with this passing E diminished chord. It could be 7, 7 of 6, but actually now that I'm realizing it, it makes a little bit more sense to call it 6 half diminished 7th as a byproduct of the melodic minor scale. That's something that we do see from time to time, but it kind of feels like the leading tone chord 2/7 just by virtue of the fact that it's a diminished chord or a diminished sonority preceding a chord that feels like it is the leading tone of. So F, A, C, and A is our 7 chord. So whether this is 7 of 7 or 6 half diminished, that's entirely up to you to decide. I think it could be one or the other, but afterwards we get a similar thing going on here, but a little bit more common of a progression where we see 7 used as a stable predominant chord. We have F sharp and D here, and with these two A's, that would be 5, 6, D major over F sharp, and that takes us to G minor, G, B flat, D, and G, which is our tonic triad and root position. G is also a it's also a chord tone, so we don't need to mark it before we cadence on D major, D, A, D, and F. It's our 5 chord. All right, we're going to our last cadence. Perfect authentic. Phrase stays in the key of G minor. Actually starts with an interesting chord. We start with G7, B natural, G, D, and F. This would be 5, 6, 5 of 4. So G is also the dominant of C. And in minor keys, it's much more evident that it's being used as 5 of C, unlike this right here, which requires the flatted 7th to fully be contextualized. But this takes us to 4, C, G, D, and E flat. D being a 9/8 suspension over our little temporary tonic here. C is a chord tone. B flat's a passing 7th. We then go to C, F sharp, A, and D. It's 5, 4, 2, and we would expect that to resolve to 1, 6. And even though it doesn't immediately do it like as a subdivision, it does resolve the way that we would expect on the next beat. We have B flat, which is a non-chord tone. A is a chord tone and does very, very briefly take the chord and put it in second inversion and removes the 7th, but I don't really think it's super consequential, so I'm not going to bother marking it, even though that you could be very, very granular and say that for a 16th note the chord changes, which I think sometimes to make sense or I guess filter the chord progression through a tonal lens, you do need the 16th notes to explain exactly what's going on from the harmonic perspective, but I don't really think it's super important in the grand scheme of things because we get the resolution on the next beat. B flat, G, D, and G, which is 1, 6, so 5, 4, 2 resolves the way we would expect. And we see a similar thing going on here where instead of turning from 1 to 6 by switching the lower voices, we get 1, 6 to 5, 3 happening here. So definitely interesting that we're seeing a little bit of symmetry here via this subdivided vocal switching or voice swapping. That takes us to A minor 7 flat 5 over C, C, A, E flat, and G. You know that Bach loves 2, 6, 5 chords, especially in first inversion, or especially in cadential context. 2, 6, 5 chords are always in first inversion. That's what the figured bass means. And then we have a 5 chord, D, A, D, and F sharp with this chordal 7th here happening as sort of an enclosure around this B natural. And then we have G major, G, B natural, D, and G, which is our major tonic triad. Bach often ends his minor chorales with major tonic triads. I think it has to do with his relationship with major chords over minor chords in terms of the finality of their quality. But that's the analysis for today. Just thinking if there's anything that I wanted to talk about. This chord progression is particularly quirky, like ascending the scale with this chromaticism is pretty interesting. Couple of tonics as 5 of 4. Right here in a major key and right here as a minor key or in a minor key. But other than that, really the harmony is functional and straightforward. Definitely a lot easier to analyze than yesterday's chorale. So I think I'm going to cap the video off on that thought. If you're interested in following me along on the journey to analyze all of Bach's chorale harmonizations, feel free to subscribe to the channel, hit the notification icon, and like the video if you enjoyed the content. Thank you so much for watching the video and supporting the channel by doing so. I look forward to tomorrow's analysis, and I hope you take care.